Hello, everyone. My name is Mel Hartley, and I'm one of the team here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I would like to welcome you to this webinar on vet student support. We'll be focusing on outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2. Before we go any further, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are meeting on today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, I would love to hand over to Sheevaun Gallacher, who is our facilitator for today. Thank you, Sheevaun.
Thanks, Mel. Welcome everyone to this Monday morning session and welcome again to the TAC webinar on student support, which is basically covering outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2, which in a nutshell covers information, enrolment, and basically the suitability of the training product for the student. So the objective of today is to give you a bit of an overview around what your actual responsibilities are with regards to outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2. So when you leave, you possibly have a bit of plan in mind about how you might address some of this in terms of where you're at with your own RTO. The webinar should run for about 60 minutes. We've left about 10 minutes, hopefully, at the end for some questions. So feel free to use the Mentimeter and I'll put the code up shortly. There is a fact sheet that's been developed to accompany the webinar. And again, we'll put that probably up on the last slide so you'll be able to access that on the TAC online guidance hub. You'll also have the opportunity to, as always, provide your feedback to TAC. Obviously not just about this webinar, but anything else that you think is relevant and you feel would be useful to you in the coming months. Okay, so what we're going to cover today, put a bit of a guideline together. So we're going to look at, basically start off with a look at the process of enrolment and what that might look like in terms of the 2025 standards. What your roles and responsibilities are as RTOs around the information that you provide. And some of that might not necessarily be new to you. It might just be a bit of a refresh, which will be great. We're going to look at the type of information that students expect from you and how you ensure that the training product suitability for students. And what we mean by that is how do you make sure that when you enroll the students into the courses, it is the right course for them. We're going to have a look at some case studies that we've developed. And again, those case studies are they're samples, if you like. If you, after the webinar, have a look at the fact sheet, you'll see there's some more case studies that might be useful to you, depending on the size and scale of your RTO. We'll also put up at the end a slide with some useful resources that have been developed, as always. And then there is the code for Mentimeter 36819545. So where shall we start on this journey this morning? I think the first thing to start is to go back and have a look at what was the actual intent of outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2 when the new standards were being developed. And really, the intent of these outcome standards is about making sure that when students enroll in courses with any RTO, it's the right course for them from the beginning, so that students can have a successful outcome when they start studying with an RTO. Specifically, standards 2.1 and 2.2 basically are about making sure that students can make informed choices, and of course prior to enrolment, and that the RTO has mechanisms in place to advise students on whether or not the training programme is actually suitable for them. Now, outcome standard 2.2 in particular is absolutely new to these standards. 2.1 less so, and when I go through 2.1, you'll probably start to think about, yes, I've got some of this in place already. But certainly 2.2 seems to be the new outcome standard that RTOs are really thinking about, well, how do I actually do this in terms of my current processes? So it is about allowing students to make informed choices, and also that importantly, prior to enrolment. And I'm sure when you all read that, first of all, in the new standards, you all started to think about how this was actually going to affect you and your students. Just on a side note here, I just want to remind any RTOs who have in place third-party agreements that it's still your responsibility to ensure that outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2 are met. Where I thought we would actually start in terms of the process this morning is actually start to think about what is enrolment, what is the enrolment process? And I've managed to simplify it down into 5 high-level stages. Now, within each of these stages, there are actually a number of different steps and processes that are going to come into play. But just looking at the new standards, how you might simplify it. So if you want to take anything away from today, this would probably be my starting point for all RTOs, sitting down with your teams, looking at how you can actually look at your enrolment processes and practices in light of outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2. So let's break this down a bit further. The first stage is obviously where a student makes an inquiry. Okay, a potential student decides that they might want to do some study with an RTO. At this stage, stage one, it's often considered exploratory. And really what the student or the employer, because often it's employers that inquire, not just the students, or it could even be a parent, for example, it really is exploratory. And what they're trying to do is gather some general information about the RTO. And at that stage, for all of us that have ever enrolled in any kind of study, the important sort of criteria to begin with are, what's it going to cost me? How long is it going to take? And where is it going to be held? Okay, if you generally know which kind of course you're looking for. So at that stage, the information that students are looking for is generally quite basic. So after a student has got some basic information, they've done a bit of research, and that research might be online, or they might have phoned up an RTO themselves, or they've looked at a website, whatever it is. They then make an assessment for themselves around whether or not the course is right for them. And in terms of outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2, this is actually really critical, because what you should be looking at in terms of your new processes is, how do you get the students themselves to select or deselect whether or not a course is actually going to be right for them? And that really is about stage two, and that's about the quality of the information that you provide to the students at this particular stage that allow them to determine whether or not a course is actually going to be suitable for them. Okay? And that can be done in many, many different ways. It can be through things like, for example, they've made an initial inquiry and now they want to sit down and have a chat with someone and talk about, well, what kind of skills do I need for this? So they attend an interview, for example, with an RTO. It might not be an interview face-to-face. It might be on Teams. You might use technology. It might be over the phone. It might be that they say, well, okay, I'm not sure if a course is right for me at this stage. Is there an LLN assessment that I can do and participate in, and I can get determine whether or not the course is right for me from there? There are a whole raft of different things that could happen in that stage two of the enrolment process. But again, just to reiterate the importance of the students themselves making a selection around whether a course is suitable for them. Okay. Step three then takes us to where the potential student or employer might commence the actual application process, okay, using the forms available on the RTO's website. Okay, so that might be it might be an online application, it might be paper-based. That might also depend on whether it's work-based or institutional-based delivery. The application form itself, you need to ensure is provide sufficient information so that the student can undertake a review to determine their suitability, as well as whether or not the suitability of the programme is going to allow them to meet the outcomes that they actually want. So that's the application part of it. Step four is really where the RTO reviews the student's application. Now, again, if you've looked closely at Outcome Standard 2.2, you'll note that it is now RTO's responsibility to make sure that they review the student's application and determine which additional support might be required. And again, going back to, okay, the student at step two has done an assessment as to their suitability, but at stage four, the RTO is now undertaking an assessment as to their suitability. Just a reminder here that at stage four, if you're going to have confirmation about successful application, needs to be made in writing, so that there is some formal agreement in place. Step five in the process is about the student should be equipped with all the information that they need in order to start the training. But in addition to that, they should also know which support is available to help them. Now, one of the things that's come up recently is whether or not outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2 are actually barriers to students enrolling. But they shouldn't be barriers to students enrolling, because we know that outcome standards 2.3 to 2.8 are all about providing support. So what we don't want to do is put people off in terms of the enrolment process, but we just want to make sure that they're on the right course to start with. Okay. So what kind of things do you need to consider in terms of the information that you're going to give students? Now, this really does cover Outcome Standard 2.1. 2.1 is all about the type of information that you give to students, when you give the information to students, what happens when things change in RTOs and students need to be aware of. And that really is the crux of Outcome Standard 2.1. So things that you need to think about are the type of information that you provide to students, when you're going to provide the information to students, how the information is provided, and that includes things like accessibility for students with disabilities, and how RTOs actually inform students about how they're going to use that information that they gather. Now, most people will put that type of information now on their enrolment forms about how they use and gather information. So what kind of things do you need to think about? Well, first of all, your information, whatever it is, and we're going to cover that in the next slide, it needs to be clear. And that, what do we mean by clear? We mean that it should be easily understood and free from confusion or ambiguity. So, for example, if there are work placement hours attached to a training product, the number of actual work placement hours are actually made aware to the student, okay? So that they don't think they're coming for enrolling in a training product that has an 80-hour work placement and it's actually 120, as an example. Accurate information. And we talk about accurate information being precise, free from errors, and reliable. And really, that's about making sure that the information that you provide to students is continually updated so that it is free from errors. So information around things like the accuracy of training product titles are all considered so that students are provided with the right information. And thirdly, current information. Okay, so it has to be up to date and it has to be timely. And we know that RTOs use a range of communication strategies to engage with students. We know that we use written communication, we use verbal communication, websites, course flyers, text messages, social media. And if you think about it, in our industry, things are changing all the time. And trying to maintain and keep all those platforms with information accurate and consistent is a challenge for all RTOs. Okay, so what I've identified here on this slide is 19 pieces of different types of information that students need prior to enrolment in order for them to make an informed decision. Okay, now you might be thinking, yeah, Sheevaun, thanks, but some of them don't apply to me. However, I would challenge all RTOs to look at this list of 19, and I suspect that at least 15 out of the 19 will apply to every RTO. So where it might not apply, for example, of an enterprise-based RTO, for example, might not provide its students, because obviously they're employed with them, information on fees and subsidies. If you don't work necessarily, if there's no training product that you deliver that is legislated through specific regulation requirements or legislation, then again, you might not provide that information. However, there are 19 pieces of information that RTOs should think about in terms of what they provide to students. So the first thing is, without going into too much detail here, is the training details. And that really is about, that's the most important one. And really that's about making sure that the quality of the information you give students, you've got the right code, you've got the right qualifications, you've got the right skill set. And you would still be surprised how many times that RTOs advertise qualifications with the wrong codes. Okay, you have to, if, for example, you have any third-party arrangements, you have to provide information on those third-party arrangements. And again, for whatever reason, often RTOs forget to actually put that type of information onto their website. The use of any industry experts, of course, under the new compliance standards. If you are using industry experts, you should be letting students know that you're using industry experts. You've got, for example, the training location. Where's the training actually going to be held? Is it going to be at different sites? Will students need to travel? How might that affect their learning? If there's a work placement element as opposed to where they're going for their institutional delivery, all those kind of things need to be identified under training location. The learning pathway, and whether it's employment-based or institutional-based, the delivery mode, is it classroom, is it online, is it workplace, etc. And the course duration, and you should be specifying that in either hours, days, weeks, months, years, with as much as possible specific dates, if you know start dates and end dates. What the learning outcomes of any programme, any training product is. For example, quite often you'll see on RTO's websites, they might have the title of the training product, but they don't actually tell you what that covers. So there are no objectives or the learning outcomes. The assessment methods that are going to be used, written, observation, case studies, portfolio, all those things you wouldn't believe, but these all things are really important to students, how they're actually going to be assessed. The resources that the student might need in order to complete the course, any uniforms, PPE, technology, textbooks, all those kind of things. Any training costs, that's the cost of the training, and any other fees that might not be explicitly implied. LLND requirements, so if there's a level of LLND, and of course we're going to come to that under Outcome Standard 2.2, any entry skills that the student will need to hold, any experience that you want them to have before they come, and what kind of student support you're going to provide to students. So for example, accessibility to your premises, safe spaces for students to access culturally sensitive practices, and any considerations that you might need to make for students under the age of 18. Any fees and subsidies, specifically in relation to any government funding, students' rights, obligations and requirements, certification, i.e. what will the student actually achieve at the end of the course, and any other licensing, regulatory or legislative requirements, either before, during or after the course, that might impact for a student. Now, this is a huge list of information, okay, and there is a lot in there. However, if you think about it in the context of whenever you've been a student yourself, the more information you get up front, the more generally successful you'll be, because you'll be in the right course from the beginning. And realistically, Outcome Standard 2.1 is all about giving students information so that they can make a determination on whether or not the course is actually right for them. Okay, so there's a lot of information there. So the question around this really for you, as well as I think it was slide 6, which was really about starting with your enrolment process. So when was the last time, the question to you is, when was the last time that your RTO revisited its student information across all its mediums? So print-based, electronic-based, for clarity, accuracy and currency. And what's your actual process for doing this? And do you have a formal process? And is it the fact you don't have a formal process that is in fact letting you down? So here are some suggestions for you around a process that you might want to think about. So again, going back to just that previous slide, what's really important under this outcome standards is about the size and scale of your RTO, okay? And the training products that you deliver, how you deliver them, all of those things are going to come into play around the type of information that you provide. And what I've tried to do here is just come up with some ideas, regardless of the size of your RTO, of things that you can put in place to make sure that you keep this information up to date and current. So things like, for example, having a dedicated person, okay, or assigned job tasks, someone who can actually review your marketing material to ensure, you can ensure it's part of a current staff member's job description, for example. You've got administrative marketing team or part of a role to ensure that ongoing quality information is available. Use proofreading tools for accuracy and grammar. And I'm sure you've seen it yourself when you've been looking for training courses and you go into RTO websites and there's spelling mistakes. These things can easily be overcome by putting in a process in place where people are actually checking information. The next thing is really about setting up work processes that automatically trigger checks at different stages of information design. Creating calendar appointments or using scheduling tools that incorporate regular dates for checking information. And the other thing about all that is, at the end of the day, ask your own team members, because they themselves will actually have ideas about how you can actually keep your information up to date so that it is as streamlined as possible. One of the last considerations elements within Outcome Standard 2.1 is about how RTOs manage change, and manage change in terms of the information that they provide to students. Okay, so we all know that proactive communication builds trust and confidence in people. We all know that. And what it does is it reduces uncertainty and can build long-term relationships. So it doesn't really matter if you're public, private or enterprise. You should be looking at how transparent your communication style is. And a lot of that will go back to the slide before, which is what processes do you have in place to make sure that the information that you have is continually being reviewed and updated. So any change that impacts the students need to be communicated to them. So for example, and I know many RTOs will do a lot of this. The small changes come along. There's a training room change, a start and finish time change, a trainer change, things like that. RTOs are constantly trying to keep on top of all those small changes to keep students informed. But there are also much more complex changes that form part of Outcome Standard 2.1. Things like, for example, when there's a transition to a superseded, to a new qualification, or there are deleted or expired training products. These two particular examples, and one of them I've just got a case study to show you, there is a process that you can go through to mitigate the risk that students don't feel that they're involved in the process or kept informed. If you don't manage change and communication effectively with your students, the likelihood is they're going to become disengaged. They're going to lose confidence in your RTO, and they have the potential to damage your RTO because of that. You're going to disrupt the student progress towards successful completion, which may or may not result then in a complaint to the regulator. So managing change and managing information should be key to part of what you're thinking about under Outcome Standard 2.1. So I put together a small case study. And this case study is really about a RTO, relatively small RTO, delivers a diploma in leadership and management part-time over 2 years. Okay, the qualification's been updated to reflect the introduction of artificial intelligence, which is something that's probably going to come along and actually impact on a lot of training products in the not too distant future. And in particular, they've got new core and elective units. So the qualification has been deemed non-equivalent, and there's only 10 students, which is great. And they have a 12-month window to transition. Of course, the 12-month window transition is just made up. Obviously, these things vary depending on what's happening at the time. So what processes might your RTO adopt to ensure that students understand the changes that are going to take place, and how it will impact them to successfully complete? Because at the end of the day, that's what students want to know. Generally, people are happy with change if it's explained to them and the impact for them. People will accept change more freely. So what processes might the RTO adopt? Well, the first thing the RTO is going to do is they're going to appoint a qualified trainer assessor to review unit sub-competency within the old qualifications, so that's both the old and the new, and determine if there are any equivalencies. This step isn't an option, okay? This is something RTOs have to do, and should review the fact sheet that TAC has on equivalency for further information. Then they would create a list from the student management system of all the students that are affected by the change. Okay, if you do it from your student management system, you're most likely to make sure that you capture all your students. Then the RTO needs to think about how they're going to communicate this information with students. So generally you would do it in writing, because you can target a lot of people with an email. I know there's only 12, but however, you would probably still do it via email. Okay, so what you would want to do is inform the students of the change, how it's going to affect them. And then, because there's only 12 of them, invite them into your RTO to talk about how the change might actually affect them. This might be really important, particularly if you have students who, for example, have any specific learning support needs. The RTO should then think about developing a mapping document which outlines the changes required for them to complete the new qualification, and provide a copy to each student. Okay, so it's not about a group en masse, here's the communication, writing to individually. You could probably copy most people into something like that, but you have to make sure that each student receives a copy of how they're going to be affected by the change. And then the final step is about enrolling the student in a new qualification and providing a timetable for the student to successfully complete. Now, that's just a very simple example of a change management process that really sits under Outcome Standard 2.1 and about how you use information, how to inform students and keep them up to date in terms of what's happening with their qualifications. The truth of the matter is that things are changing all the time, and none of us live in a world where there is no change. So the more you can do to keep people informed, then the more likely the students are more likely to be successful. Many RTOs have transition procedures in place as per this example, but often those procedures lack clarity and sufficient detail, leading to student confusion. And confusion can often lead to anxiety. And when people get anxious about their training products, that's when things can actually start to go wrong. So just to recap, before we move on, Outcome Standard 2.1 is about quality of information that you provide students, how you use that information for students, the type of information you give to students, and how you manage information that's provided to students. So that's what you need to think of in terms of Outcome Standard 2.1. Outcome Standard 2.2 is really about the suitability of the training product. And in many ways, this is the outcome standard that I think most RTOs are generally being concerned with. I've broken this down into kind of 3 different stages. So in the context of the training product, the RTO needs to have a procedure in place to review the skills and competencies of the student, including LLND. Okay. Note the word review in the outcome standards, and I'm sure most of you will have picked up on this. They use the word review in terms of the design of the outcome standard and not word assessment. And that's because when you think of a review, it can mean something different from an assessment. So we're going to keep referring to it as a review. Then you've got to have in place a mechanism for advising the students whether or not the training product is suitable for them. And of course, as we now know, that has to happen prior to enrolment to ensure they're on the right fit course. And you have to have a process for how students are informed of your decision to enrol them or otherwise. And obviously for some RTOs, I say or otherwise, because sometimes it's not appropriate for a student to enrol in a certain course. Of course, they themselves may have deselected themselves based on the information you gave them under outcome standard 2.1. But if not, it might also be that once you've reviewed their skills and competencies L&D, for example, you have yourself decided that a training product isn't suitable for a student. A simple example of that is where, for example, someone might want to enrol in a diploma level qualification, but you don't have the skills and competencies, and you're recommending them, for example, to enrol in a certificate 3 or a certificate 4. Okay. The main thing to consider in terms of the intent of this particular outcome standard is that a prospective student cannot commit to enrolling in a training product or incur any financial burden in relation to the training product until they've had advice on whether or not the training product is suitable for them. So in terms of that, RTOs might be able to adapt an existing procedure or determine to create a new procedure, because I think all RTOs are going to have to rethink their procedure based on that. Okay. So what is it that RTOs actually have to do prior to enrolment? Okay, so there are basically I've identified 4 steps of things that need to happen prior to enrolment. Okay, the first step that I've identified here up on the slide is actually outcome standard 2.1, which is around information, making information accessible, making sure it's accurate, and that it is fully developed so that students can make informed decisions. Okay. Step 2, 3, and 4 are really around this idea next, which is what we're going to cover now, which is about actually what do I need to do now? Okay, so prior to enrolment, stage 2 talks about reviewing the prospective student's skills to ensure they've got the necessary language literacy, numeracy, and digital proficiency to undertake the intended training. Okay, I want to highlight here that it's not just about LLN, it's not just about LLND, it's about LLND and student potential skills. And again, what we're not trying to do is put people off students enrolling through this process. We're just trying to make sure that the students are on the right training program that's suitable for them. Okay, so we've got to review the prospective student skills, and we've got to review those against something, okay, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then we've got to inform the prospective students about the extent of support services available. And this includes any limits that the RTOs have in terms of being able to meet individual learning needs. Okay, because it might be that a student wants to enroll with you, but really you don't have the support mechanism in place. That's okay. The idea then would be to make sure that you can then help the student progress to potentially an RTO that can help them meet their needs. Okay. So that's step 3, is about informing the prospective student about the extent of support and whether or not you feel the product is right for them. And then the final stage in this process is where a prospective student doesn't have the required skills and competencies. You need to advise them that the training product is not suitable for them and perhaps suggest something else. Okay, so these are the 4 things that need to happen prior to enrolment. So again, going back to slide 6, which was the process graphic around enrolment, what you probably want to do is look at slide 6 in the context of also slide 15 and actually start to think about how you would build in these steps on slide 15 into slide 6. Okay, a closer look at step 2 then. How are we going to review the prospective student skills? Okay, to make sure that the training product will be suitable for them. So first of all, what is it that you're actually reviewing their skills against? So for most people, it will be an initial look at perhaps the performance criteria, the elements and the assessment requirements of a particular training product. But there are other things that you need to consider as well. You need to consider things like the foundation skills, the technical or vocational abilities. Are there any prerequisites within the units? Anything at all that you think could impact on that training product is what you need to be thinking about in terms of reviewing skills against. So the procedure that you're going to develop in place what I've identified here on the screen is 6 different ways in which you can review a potential student's skills. Okay. Now, not all of them necessarily need to be formal. They have to be possibly recorded so that you have some record of it, but they don't all need to be formal. So things like, for example, interviews with students. Now, I know that already RTOs that have started to think about this have actually been developing new pre-enrolment interview sheets to discuss with students and asking questions around skills and competencies. You've also got online questionnaires, and we're all used to things like the LLM robot now. Again, that's a useful tool if you want to use that. There are also things like direct observation, which may be harder for RTOs to use, but nonetheless, it's a possibility. There are LLM assessments that students can use, and these are not necessarily LLM robot systems, but these might be LLM assessments that are developed in-house. You can review previous work samples of students. That could be part of the pre-enrolment process. And there's obviously some digital literacy checks that you might want to also undertake as well. Although I also think now that a lot of enrolment happens digitally anyway, so that's usually a good way of indicating if someone actually has digital skills. So that's just some of the ways in which you can review a prospective student's skills. Now, the interesting thing is all RTOs are different. They're different in size of scale, training product, institutional-based delivery, workplace delivery, short courses, long year courses, whatever it is. Therefore, in terms of reviewing a prospective student's skills, not one size is going to fit all. And what I think in terms of where we're going to be coming from in terms of looking at RTOs in terms of meeting the standard is they have to choose an approach that's right for their business and right for their student cohort. So bear that in mind when you're developing your new procedure around the review of prospective student skills and competencies. So when we talk about what do we mean by the depth of a review of the student's skills? Okay, so for example, just to reiterate there, if a student comes to you and their program is 12 months or 2 years or a 3-year program, the likelihood is a review of their skills and competencies to get onto that course is going to be a bit more detailed than, for example, a 1-day short online course. Right? There's no doubt about that. So therefore, your procedure should actually reflect that. So we're not advocating that every procedure will necessarily be the same or that you're going to develop lots of different procedures per se, but it's about taking a high-level view of your training products and how you deliver them, and then coming up with the best review based on that. Okay. So another example might be an employer-initiated training program, for example, might require more coordination with workplace supervisors to assess the suitability of students. And that might be a completely different way to do a review for a student or a group of students. So there is going to be no one size fits all. So any procedure that you're thinking about developing or that you should be developing and looking at has to take that into account as well. So in terms of your actual procedure, the key factors that you think you should be considering in terms of developing it are your student cohort characteristics, things like employed and unemployed, previous education, social cultural background, disabilities, preferred language, age. So that really is about looking at your student in a level of detail. Put that in a basket, and then you've got the length and the nature of the training program in another basket. Okay, how long is this program? Is it a short course? Is it 2-3 years? Is it 6 months? Whatever it is, and the nature of the training program. And the nature of the training program might be the extent to which it's a hands-on apprenticeship type versus more theory-based, something like that. Whether the student or employer has initiated the need for the training. So where has that actually come from? Because and one of the cases I'm going to show you, that might impact your procedure as well. Because there's an opportunity when you work with, for example, employers directly, you're building trust and confidence with them over a period of time. So your actual procedure for reviewing potential candidate skills will be slightly different. Again, whether it's employment-based or institutional-based. Now, the thing about that is that if you offer both employment-based training at the moment and institutional-based training, the likelihood is your procedures are going to be slightly different. So in many ways, you're not going to be creating anything, you're going to be creating a new procedure with new elements to it, but you will always have two different types of procedures for that. And then you've got to think of your mode of delivery, classroom, online, workplace, including any work placement requirements or a combination of any of those. So when you're looking at developing your procedure for meeting outcome standard 2.2, here are some of the things that you need to think about. And your procedure should probably be able to identify students these types of things that I've just listed on this slide. So you should be able to say what your students look like. You should be able to say, this is the nature of my program and this is why I've done it. It's a student-based program. It's institutional-based. This is why I've done it a certain way. And this is my mode of delivery. So you should be able to, just by using some of those key factors there, develop your procedure and be confident that your procedure is actually going to meet the needs of the outcome standards. So there are actually a range of frameworks that you can actually help you develop your skills review and your LLN review. And some of them, of course, you know about already. For example, you know, for example, that there's ACSF, the Australian Core Skills Framework, but there's actually some other frameworks that are quite useful that I've identified in the fact sheet. For example, the DIGCOM framework is a really good one to determine for helping you understand different levels of digital literacy that might apply. And you can find that information in the actual fact sheet. Okay. So let's assume then that you've done your review of the students' skills and LLND, and you now have to provide them with advice. Okay, so a lot of the questions are being, well, what does this advice look like? And again, this will go back to the previous slide. Who are your students? What's the nature of your training program? How long does your training program last? There is not going to be one size fits all. But whatever it is, you need to provide an explanation, well, i.e. success or not successful. It needs to be prompt so that they can make sure they can continue with the enrolment process so that they meet requirements at the start date. And any information should be concise enough so that they understand any decision that has actually been made. Okay. So in terms of one of the other questions that has come up is who should undertake the review? Okay, who undertakes this review of the student's LLND? Well, again, there is no probably right or wrong answer to this. It really is about the job role of the person nominated within your RTO to do this. Okay, but inevitably they have to have a level of skill in understanding what it is they're actually reviewing. So your procedure will need to include the person or group of people that are actually going to be undertaking this review and their particular skill set in relation to being able to do this. So what I want to do is just take a look at a couple of case studies. So this first case study is to give you an idea. So this is DBD Learning. It's private RTO and delivers training in work health and safety. So the current enrolment process is face-to-face, all right, where basically they go along and the students complete a hard copy of an enrolment form and gather all the information that we need for event-based reporting. So the program details are the student cohort that are employed, okay, so that's useful to know. And they have some element of WHS within the role. So in terms of skills, I'm already thinking, yep, so they've probably already got some skills that could be useful for this course. The training program will be delivered on the employer's premises, face-to-face over 12 months. So I now know it's also a 12-month program. The employers initiated the training. Okay, so I probably would do a wee bit more development or investigation around why this is happening. The qualification is going to be AQF level 4, which is really useful in terms of understanding the Australian Core Skills Framework against units of competence contained within the AQF level 4 qualifications. Some of the students already hold VET or university qualifications. So again, in terms of reviewing skills and competencies, that's really useful to know because they've already got formal qualifications. And it's the employer who's recommending students for entry into this qualification. So it's the employer who's basically putting up the students. Now that scenario there is quite typical of what might happen, particularly for RTOs that deliver this kind of training. Okay, so that's the background to the case study. So how might DBD Learning's enrolment procedure change in light of the 2025 standards? Okay, so here's a revised enrolment process. This revised enrolment process is one of a number of lots of different ways that this enrolment process could be developed. Okay, so this is not necessarily the be all and end all. It's there to give you a framework for how this particular case study might roll out. So the first thing is that all the students are invited to attend an information session prior to commencement to find out about the course. So this is organised by the employer. At the information session, the students are provided with all the information about the course, and they're required to complete a hard copy questionnaire that was developed by the RTO. So the RTO developed this questionnaire themselves. So the questionnaire includes both LLND and a skills questionnaire, and the RTO used the ACSF as the main source document to develop their quiz. And what I mean by that was they went back and had a look at the qualification, the Certificate for Work Health and Safety, and they looked at it in terms of the ACSF competencies. And the questionnaire that they developed was based on that. So the questionnaire has been developed at the appropriate AQF level and aims to measure student foundation skills specific to the training product. So, for example, specifically research skills, communication skills, risk management, and WHS tasks. Okay, so already what we're starting to do is build a questionnaire that isn't just very generic, it's actually a bit more specific to what the students are actually going to learn. So the questionnaire also invites the students to specify any specific additional support that they might need. So that could be educational support, or it could be any kind of support, really. Once the students have completed the questionnaire, a trainer, assessor, or other appropriate staff member, yet to be determined, will complete a review providing written feedback. Okay. So the student will decide then, based on the written feedback, whether they wish to proceed with the enrolment and/or the employer in this particular case, because sometimes at that point, students deselect as well themselves and go to their employers. And then finally, the students will complete a formal application for enrolment document, which should be completed prior to the first training session. Okay. Now, again, this is only provided to you to show you how this might work prior to enrolment. Okay. So let's look at another case study. First Aids Are Us. It's a small RTO that delivers only 1 unit competence in first aid. The current enrolment process is that students enrol online via the RTO student management system prior to commencement. So the details of the programme. The students have completed the first aid unit previously and are completing this course as part of a refresher. So again, already I'm thinking to myself, yep, the students have actually got some skills in this area already. So I've just got to be able to capture that. The training lasts 1 day with some prerequisite learning, which is digital in nature. Now, for most anybody that knows anything about first aid training, most courses nowadays you have to do some pre-learning, which is generally digital in nature. It's often the employer who requests the training on behalf of their employees. Okay, so let's have a look now at the revised enrolment process. So Faro has updated its current online enrolment process to ensure a review of the student LLND and skills can be undertaken, and that no fees are taken in advance of training, which of course is critically important and is covered with an outcome standard 2.1. Okay, so the other thing about that is that it's now updated its online enrolment process. So they've developed a new process. The enrolment questionnaire includes a collation of LLND skills and national data collection as part of a seamless online process. Okay, so what they've gone for here is looking at a system or developing a current system that gives the student a seamless process. First Aids Are Us created the questionnaire for the LLND and skills assessment using the foundation skills contained within the unit of competence. So their source information for reviewing the skills wasn't an ACSF document, as per the previous case study, but was the foundation skills that are listed in the unit of competence, as well as the DIGCOM framework, which is the framework around digital competence I was referring to earlier. Given that the students require digital skills to complete the prerequisite component of the framework, the DIGCOM framework provided valuable information about how the RTO should go about reviewing the skills against that. The questionnaire that has been developed is at the appropriate AQF level and aims to measure the student capability in areas such as communication, written and verbal, the use of first aid equipment, interpreting documents, and assessing high-risk situations. Okay. The online system that Faro has put in place will automatically highlight if a student has challenges meeting the requirements of the unit of competency or assessment. And based on that information, students may or may decide not to proceed with enrolment and seek further information about something else that's more suitable. The completed online questionnaires will be provided to members of the student support team in this particular instance, or similar prior to training commencement. Where any challenges are highlighted, they're going to be discussed with the student prior to commencement. Successful students will automatically be notified of their suitability for the course. So there are some key words that keep coming up in terms of outcome standards, 2.2 in particular, which are things like prior to enrolment, advise, suitability of the training product. And if you think about when you're developing your new procedure around this, start to use this type of language in your procedure, and it will become much more obvious the type of procedure that you know will benefit you and your students and will become seamless. Okay, so the key change for RTOs to consider in reference to outcome standard 2.2 is that the RTOs need to determine a student's suitability for a course prior to enrolment, prior to enrolment. Whilst this is going to present some initial challenges, there is absolutely no doubt about it. It also presents an opportunity, and that opportunity is actually about RTOs being able to go back and review what they currently have in place and making sure they're making use of the fact that students themselves can deselect if you give them really good information, and also the extent to which you're using online systems to help you. So in terms of TAC's approach to outcome standards 2.1, 2.2 in particular, this should not be something that we want RTOs to worry or panic about, and we don't want it to become something that becomes bigger than Ben-Hur. But as much as possible, think about how the procedure itself can be self-managed, either by the student or through using an online system. And there are plenty of online systems out there. So in summary, I've just developed three questions with answers, and these are the three questions that RTOs keep asking. So the first one is, I need to create a new procedure that covers outcome standard 2.1 and 2.2, Outcome standard 2.2 requires RTOs to have a procedure in place that ensures students are advised prior to enrolment about training product suitability. Information contained within outcome standard 2.1 is likely to be included in this procedure, i.e. what information are you giving students, when are you giving them information, how are you using that information? And it might be that your RTO already has an existing procedure that can be adapted, or you might want to develop a new one. But if you are going to look at, and as you should be, think about the staff that you want to involve in that process. If you involve your support teams, your trainers, assessors, you're more likely to get a better outcome in terms of a new procedure that's going to fit everyone. That's the first question. Question 2 that keeps coming up. Do I basically need to undertake an assessment of each student's skills and competencies? And I framed that particular question with the word assessment to remind you it's not necessarily an assessment, it's a review. Outcome standard 2.2 states that taking into account the requirements of the training product, a review of skills and competencies should be undertaken. A review involves a critique or evaluation which may be undertaken in different ways through, for example, LLN assessments, digital checks, interviews, online questionnaires, whatever. So there's a lot of different ways to think about how you're actually going to meet this outcome standard. The review should reflect your operating environment, because the premise of the new standards for RTOs is all about what you do in your business and how you meet those standards within the context of that business. So think about it like that. And finally, because I'm a small RTO, I'm a large RTO, do I need to inform students about the outcomes of a skills review? Regardless of the size of your RTO, each student should be informed as to whether they've been successful in their application to commence training. Every student, That might be online, it might be through a telephone call. There are a number of different ways that could happen, but every student should be informed. That's critical to the new standards. Questions? A student is fully informed in the pre-enrolment process and is advised that they are not yet ready to enter the course and offer an alternative course, but they still insist on enrolling. Well, I'm not sure anyone can still insist on enrolling into your RTO. If you have the correct procedures in place and you're transparent in your process that you have used, then you would be quite within your right as an RTO to, and I'm not going to use the word reject, to advise the student that it's not suitable for them and that they should seek alternative study. And of course, you know, nobody, when a student comes to you and they want to study, I don't think we should be, we're not trying to put people off, but we try to make sure it's the best course for them. And part of our role then is if something it's not right for them, trying to help them understand why it's not right for them and pointing them in the right direction. In 2.2b, is documented evidence required to the advice provided to students? Okay. My question would be, my response would be this. How would you, as an RTO, provide evidence to show that you had met this outcome if you didn't have it documented somewhere? But what does documented mean? Documented means different things. Documented could be a signature on an enrolment form. Documented could be acceptance of an email that has someone been sent. There's lots of ways you can interpret that. If it was me, I would be looking to keep some form of record. If only because that would be good, a good part of a process to make sure that each stage in a process you have accurate information. If you go back to what we were talking about earlier, accurate information is about keeping records as well as much as anything else. So documented evidence, if you don't have it documented, how would you be able to justify that in an audit? That would be a question for you. Does the application for enrolment process apply to students studying to a traineeship when their mandatory qualifications for the industry? Does the application for enrolment? Absolutely. At the end of the day, this outcome standards 2.1, 2.2 apply to all students, regardless of what type of mode of study, how long the course is, what the training product is, whether it's an EQF level 1 qualification, whether it's an advanced diploma, institutional based, 1 day, whatever. The application enrolment process needs to apply to everyone. But again, depending on your traineeship process, it might look and feel a wee bit different from an institutional based enrolment process. If the qualification is superseded, but students will complete the qualification before the transition date, do you still need to inform them of the change? Well, my question to you would be, would the change be affecting them? If the change is going to affect a student, then of course you would. If the change is not going to necessarily to affect them, then maybe that would be something you might deliberate. But if the change doesn't affect them, then you possibly wouldn't. I mean, that would just be creating work for yourself. And I'm not sure why you would necessarily do that in this particular instance. Yeah. Please comment on the review of the skills and competencies for LLND for training products that have nil entry requirements. Okay, well, there are lots of products that don't have any entry requirements, prerequisites. The point is that you still have to undertake an LLND. And if you go back to some of the case studies, there are different frameworks that you can use to help you. You could develop your own, for example. It's not about, this isn't about that there are no entry requirements. This is about looking at the actual training product itself and taking a review of the training product, regardless of whether there are any entry requirements, and then developing a review based on that, whatever that review is, using things like the ACSF or not necessarily, or developing your own questionnaire or using the DIGCOM, whatever it is that you want to use, the foundation skills, if they've got foundation skills. So the review isn't about whether there's entry requirements or not. The review is about the actual training product. Ensuring a student is suited to their selected course becomes tricky when a training contract is in place and the RTO course selection is one of the last steps. Any suggestions for managing this? Let me think about what you're saying here. Ensuring a student is suited to the selected course becomes tricky when a training contract is in place and the RTO course selection is one of the last steps. Any suggestion for that? I'm not sure what you're saying here. Ensuring a student is suited to the selection course becomes tricky. Okay, so in this particular instance, are you asking that a training contract's in place, that the course selection has already been made for the student? I wonder if that's what you're suggesting here. Where training contract's in place, the traineeship, they've already got it. Any suggestions for managing this? What I would do is just go back to the outcome standard 2.1. If the course selection is already being made on a number of different parameters around legislation or regulation or whatever it is, then outcome standard 2.1, which is about information, as long as you're providing that information upfront to students and explaining why, then you should cover yourself in terms of compliance requirements, because what you're actually saying is there is rationale for the reason we're doing this. If you want to enroll in our course, these are the units of competence that you are going to study, and this is actually the reason why. I'm not sure if that answers your question exactly, but yeah. Is the RTO required to inform students prior to enrolment if the RTO plans to bring in an industry expert for one or more sessions? Right. Now, you wouldn't necessarily, you would have that listed, I think, as maybe I hope I said, under standard 2.1, you would have that perhaps as one of your information comments or dot points on your website or in your course flyers. For example, we use industry experts in this area to cover X training product. Okay, you could do that. But you wouldn't necessarily have to tell them prior to enrolment that specific point. The more likelihood is that if you are using industry experts, you've said that in your pre-information, which they're actually going to get pre-enrolment, if that makes sense, without thinking about it too hard in terms of your process. When informing students of an unsuccessful outcome, do we need to give the reason, and does there need to be a appeal? I feel my students will be listened to very shit. Look, in terms of transparency, yes, you would always need to give someone a reason. You have to be transparent, and we should all be as transparent as possible. And do they have a right to appeal? That's a very good question. I think that your procedure would have a right to appeal, because sometimes, and I remember this from my own experience when I had my own RTO and someone applied and they had to complete an LLN assessment. And for example, they didn't take it seriously enough, and I had to go back to them and say, no, I'm sorry, you're not suitable for this particular course. And the person in question had an engineering degree, I think it was, and they were looking to do a leadership and management qualification. And they basically said, well, can I appeal that? And of course, absolutely, they can appeal against it and then do the assessment or another assessment of equivalent nature. But it's not about discriminating. Remember, it's not about, what we're not trying to do is, we're not, outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2 in particular, we're not trying to put people off, we're not trying to discriminate. We're trying to make sure it is the right fit, they're in the right training program, and that if they need the support, yes, we'll have the support mechanisms in place. That's what's important. Can you comment on the assessment around processes such as RPL or many processes around training? Yep. Can you comment on the implications to assessment only processes such as RPL and workplace assessment? The actual the procedure that you develop, you're still going to have to make sure that information is provided up front, and you're still going to have to make sure that the students are advised up front. In many ways, it's no different, because if you think about it, the RPL process, only in the last few years I applied to do qualification through RPL. And during that procedure, if I think about it now, prior to enrolment, I could have been advised whether or not the training product was suitable for me. So in many ways, it actually isn't any different. Your procedure will take account of the fact that it is an RPL process on assessment only pathway, but you're still going to have to provide the information up front and do a review up front prior to enrolling the students. So you can't get around that. Is that it? Yeah. Okay, so just a couple of things. First of all, your references and resources. You've obviously got the standards. What I do want to highlight is that the fact sheet for this particular webinar is slightly differently. It's got a different name from the webinar. The fact sheet is called Vet Student Support, Information, Enrolment and Suitability of the Training Product, which for me, which is all really what standard 2.1 and 2.2 are about. Okay, and as always, please provide your feedback, any other education programs that you think would be useful. Mel and the team are always looking for some feedback on that as well. And we will send you a link. And yeah, good luck with outcome standards 2.1 and 2.2. I'm sure in a year's time, every RTO will be quite au fait with it, and we'll have a new procedure in place that will make sure that students are on the right training products for themselves. Thanks very much.